자, 영어 원서 500번 읽기 버니큘라 한번 이제 1회독 끝났고요. 2회독 들어갈 차례입니다. 오늘은 최대한 많이 읽을 수 있도록 제가 해볼게요. 500번 해보지요. 500번 겁이 납니다. 그래도 해보겠습니다. Binocular, A Rabbit Tale of Mystery by Deborah and James Ho. Editor's note. The book you are about to read was brought to my attention in a most unusual way. One Friday afternoon, just before closing time, I heard a scratching sound at the front door of my office. When I opened the door, there before me stood a sad-eyed, droopy-eared dog carrying a large plain envelope in his mouth. He dropped it at my feet, giving me a soulful glance, and with a great, quiet dignity sauntered away. Inside the envelope was the manuscript of the book you now hold in your hands, together with this letter. Gentlemen, the enclosed story is true. It happened in this very town to me and the family with whom I reside. I have changed the names of the family in order to protect them. But in all other respects, everything you will read here is factual. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Harold. I come to writing purely by chance. My full-time occupation is dog. I live with Mr. and Mrs. X, called here the Monroes, and their two sons, Toby, aged 8, and Pete, aged 10. Also sharing our home is a cat named Chester, whom I am pleased to call my friend. We were a typical American family, and still are, though the events related in my story have, of course, had their effects on our lives. I hope you will find this tale of sufficient interest to yourself and your readers to warrant its publication. Sincerely, Harold X. Chapter 1. The Arrival. I shall never forget the first time I laid these now tired old eyes on our visitor. I had been left home by the family with the admonition to take care of the house until they returned. That's something they all always say to me when they go out. Take care of the house, Harold, you are the watchdog. I think it's their way of making up for not taking me with them, as if I wanted to go anyway. You can lie down at the movies and still see the screen, and the people think you are being impolite if you fall asleep and start to snore or scratch yourself in public. No, thank you. I'd rather be stretched out on my favorite rug in front of a nice, whistling radiator. But I digress. I was talking about the first night. Well, it was cold. The rain was pelting the windows, the wind was howling, and it felt pretty good to be indoors. I was lying on the rug with my head on my paws, just staring absently at the front door. My friend Chester was curled up on the brown velvet armchair, which years ago he'd staked out at his own. I saw that once again he'd covered the whole seat with his cat hair, and I chuckled to myself, picturing the scene tomorrow. Next to grasshoppers, there is nothing that frightened Chester more than the vacuum cleaner. In the midst of this reverie, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I didn't even bother to get up and see who it was. I knew it had to be my family, the Monroes, since it was just about time for the movie to be over. After a moment, the front door flew open. There they stood in the doorway, Toby and Pete and Mom and Dad Monroe. There was a flash of lightning, and in its glare, I noticed that Mr. Monroe was carrying a little bundle, with tiny glistening eyes. Pete and Toby bounded into the room, both talking at the top of their lungs. Toby shouted. Put him over here, Dad. Take your boots off, you are soaking wet, replied his mother, somewhat calmly, I thought, under the circumstances. But Mom, what about... First, stop dripping on the carpet. Would somebody like to take this? Asked Mr. Monroe, indicating the bundle with the eyes. I'd like to remove my coat. I will, Pete yelled. No, I will, said Toby. I found him. You will drop him. I will not. You will too. Mom, Pete punched me. I'll take him, said Mrs. Monroe. Take off your coat this minute. But she became so involved in helping the boys out of their coat that she didn't take him at all. My tranquil evening had been destroyed, and no one had even said hello to me. I whimpered to remind them that I was there. Harold, cried Toby, guess what happened to me? And then, all over again, everyone started talking at once. At this point, I feel I must explain something in our family. Everyone treats everyone else with great respect for his or her intelligence. That goes for the animals as well as the possible. Everything that happens to them is explained to us. It's never been just a goodbye, Harold, or use the little box, Chester, at our house. Oh no. With us, it's, hey Harold, Dad got a raise and now we're in a higher tax bracket. Or, come sit on the bed, Chester, and watch this Wild Kingdom show. Maybe you will see a relative. Which shows just how thoughtful they are. But after all, Mr. Monroe is a college professor, and Mrs. Monroe is a lawyer. And so we think of it as a rather special household, and we are, therefore, rather special pets. So it wasn't at all surprising to me that they took the time to explain the strange circumstances surrounding the arrival of the little bundle with the glistening eyes now among us. It seems that they had arrived at the theater late, and rather than trip over the feet of the audience already seated, they decided to sit in the last row, which was empty. They tiptoed in and sat down very quietly, so they wouldn't disturb anyone. Suddenly, Toby, who's the little one, sprang up from his chair and squealed that he had sat on something. Mr. Monroe told him to stop making a fuss and move to another seat. But in an unusual display of independence, Toby said he wanted to see just what it was he had sat on. And the usher came over to their row to shush them. And Mr. Monroe borrowed his flashlight. What they found on Toby's chair was the little blanket bundle that was now sitting on Mr. Monroe's lap. They now unwrapped the blanket, and there in the center was a tiny black and white rabbit. Sitting in the shoebox filled with dirt, a piece of paper had been tied to his neck with a ribbon. There were words on the paper, but the Monroes were unable to decipher them because they were in a totally unfamiliar language. I moved close for a better look. Now, most people might call me a mongrel, but I have some pretty fancy bloodlines running through these veins, and the Russian wolfhound happens to be one of them. Because my family got around a lot, I was able to recognize the language as an obscure dialect of the Carpathian mountain region. Roughly translated, it read, "Take good care of my baby." But I couldn't tell if it was a note from a bereaved mother or a piece of Romanian sheet music. The little guy was shivering from fear and cold. It was decided that Mr. Monroe and the boys would make a house for him out of an old crate and some heavy-duty wire mesh from the garage. From the night, the boys would make a bed for him in the shoebox. Toby and Pete ran outside to find the crate. And Mrs. Monroe went to the kitchen to get him some milk and lettuce. Mr. Monroe sat down, a dazed expression in his eyes, as if he were wondering how he came to be sitting in his own living room in a wet raincoat with a strange bunny on his lap. I signaled to Chester, and the two of us casually moseyed over a corner of the room. We looked at each other. "Well, what do you think?" I asked. "I don't think rabbits like milk," he answered. Chester and I were unable to continue our conversation because a deafening crash commanded our attention. Pete yelled from the hallway, "Ma! Toby broke the rabbit's house!" "I didn't. I just dropped it. Pete won't let me carry it." "It's too big. Toby's too little." "I'm not. You're too." "Okay, fellas," Mrs. Murnau called out as she entered with the milk and lettuce. "Let's try to get it in here with as little hysteria as possible, please." Chester turned to me and said under his breath, "That lettuce looks repulsive, but if there's any milk left, I get it." I certainly wasn't going to argue with him. I'm a waterman myself. At that moment, the crate arrived, barely standing the strain of being pulled in two directions at once. Ma, Toby says he's gonna keep the rabbit in his room. That's not fair. Harold sleeps in his room. Only sometimes, I thought, when I know he's got a leftover ham sandwich in his drawer. Toby's a nice kid. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't hurt that he shared his stash with me. It was, after all, at one of those late-night parties in Toby's room that I first developed my taste for chocolate cake. And Toby, nothing my preference, has kept me in chocolate cake ever since. Pete, on the other hand, doesn't believe in sharing, and the only time I tried to sleep on his bed, he rolled over on me and pointed me by my ears so that I couldn't move for the rest of the night. I had a cricket in my neck for days. "But he's mine," Toby said. "I found him." "You sat on him? You mean?" "I found him, and he's sleeping in my room." "You can keep Smelly Old Harold in your room, and the Chester too, if you want to, but I'm gonna keep the rabbit in mine." Smelly Old Harold? I would have bitten his ankle, but I knew he hadn't changed his socks for a week. Smelly, indeed. Mr. Monroe spoke up. "I think the best place for the rabbit is right here in the living room on that table by the window. It's a light there, and he will get lots of fresh air." "Pete is taller than I am," Toby cried. "He will be able to see the rabbit better." "Too bad, Squirt." "Okay," said Mrs. Monroe, through clenched teeth. Mrs. Monroe through clenched teeth. "Okay," said Mrs. Monroe through clenched teeth. "Let's put him to bed and make him comfortable, and then we can all get some sleep." "Why?" Pete asked. I don't want to go to sleep." Mrs. Monroe smiled a little too sweetly at Pete. "Look, Ma," said Toby. "He's not drinking his milk." Chester nudged me in the ribs. "Didn't I tell you?" he asked. "Excuse me while I make myself available." "Hey," said Toby. "We gotta name him." "Can't that wait until tomorrow?" asked Mr. Monroe. The boys shouted in unison. "No! He has to have a name right now." I have to say I agreed with them. It took them 3 days to name me, and those were the 3 most anxious days. Of my life. I couldn't sleep at all, worrying that they were really going to call me Fluffy, as Mrs. Monroe had suggested. Well, all right, sighed Mrs. Monroe. What about us, say, Bun Bun? Uh-oh. There she goes again, I thought. Where does she get them? Yuck, we all said. Well then, how about Fluffy? She offered hopefully. Pete looked at his mother and smiled. You never give up, do you, Ma? Meanwhile, Chester, who had also been named Fluffy for a short time, was rubbing against Mrs. Monroe's ankles and purring loudly. No, Chester, not now, she said, pushing him aside. He wants to help us name him, don't you, Chester? Toby asked. As he scooped him up into his arms, Chester shot me a look. I could tell this was not what he had in mind. Come on, Harold, Toby called. You've got to help with the name, too. I joined the family, and the serious thinking began. We all peeled into the box. It was the first time I had really seen him, so this is a rabbit, I thought. He sort of looks like a Chester, only he's got longer ears and a shorter tail and a monitor in his nose. Well, said Pete. After a moment, since we found him at the movies, why didn't he call him Mr. Johnson? There was a moment of silence. Who's Mr. Johnson? asked Toby. The guy who owns the movie theater, Pete answered. No one seemed to like this idea. How about Prince? Said Mr. Monroe. Dad, said Toby, are you kidding? Well, I had a dog named Prince once, he replied lamely. Prince, I thought that's a silly name for a dog. We found him at a Dracula movie. Let's call him Dracula, Toby said. That's a stupid name, said Pete. No, it's not. And anyway, I found him, so I should get to name him. Mom, you're not going to let him name him, are you? That's a favoritism, and I'll be traumatized if you do. Mrs. Monroe looked in wonder at Pete. Please, Mom. Please, Dad. Let's name him Dracula, cried Toby. Please, please, please. And with each please, he squeezed Chester a little harder. Mrs. Monroe picked up the bowl of milk and moved toward the kitchen. Chester followed her every movement with his eyes, which now seemed to be popping out of his head. When she reached the kitchen door, she turned back and said, Let's not have any more grim arguments. We will compromise. He's a bunny, and we found him at a Dracula movie, so we will call him Bunnicula. Bunnicula. That should make everybody happy, including me. What about me? Muttered Chester. I won't be happy until she puts down that milk. Well, guys, is that okay with you? She asked. Toby and Pete looked at one another, and then at the rabbit. A smile grew on Toby's face. Yeah, Ma, I think that name is just right. Pete shrugged. It's okay, but I get to feed him. Okay, I'm gonna put the milk bag in the fridge. Maybe he will drink it tomorrow. What about Chester? Toby said, dropping the frantic cat to the floor. Maybe he would like it. Chester made a beeline for Mrs. Monroe and looked up at her plaintively. Oh, Chester doesn't want any more milk, do you, Chester? You've already had your milk today. She reached down, patted Chester on his head, and walked into the kitchen. Chester didn't move. Okay, bedtime, said Mr. Monroe. Good night, Bunnicula, Toby said. Good night, Count Bunnicula, Peter said sarcastically, in what I took to be his attempt at a Transylvanian accent. I may be wrong, but I thought I saw a flicker of movement from the cage. Good night, Harold. Good night, Chester. I licked Toby good night. Good night, smelly Harold. Good night, dumb Chester. I drew on Peter's foot. Mom, Harold drew on my foot. Good night, Pete, Mrs. Murnau said with a great finality as she came back into the living room, and then more calmly. Good night, Harold. Good night, Chester. Mr. and Mrs. Murnau went up the stairs together. You know, dear, Mr. Murnau said, that was very clever, vernacular. I could never have thought of a name like that. Oh, I don't know, Robert. She smiled as she put her arm through his. I think Prince is a lovely name, too. The room was quiet. Chester was still sitting by the closed-up kitchen door, in a state of shock. Slowly, he turned to me. I wish they had named him Fluffy, was all he said. Chapter 2. Music in the Night. I feel at this time there are a few things you should know about Chester. He's not your ordinary cat. But then, I'm not your ordinary dog, since an ordinary dog wouldn't be writing this book, would he? Chester came into the house several years ago as a birthday gift for Mr. Murnau, along with the 2 volumes of G.K. Chesterton, hence the name Chester, and the first edition of Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. As a result of this introduction to literature, and given the fact that Mr. Murnau is an English professor, Chester developed a taste for reading early in life. I, on the other hand, have developed a taste of books. I found Jonathan Livingston Seeger particularly delicious. From Chester's kittenhood on, Mr. Murnau has used him as a sounding board for all his students' lectures. If Chester didn't fall asleep when Mr. Murnau is talking, the lecture can be counted a success. Every night, when the family is sleeping, Chester goes to the bookshelf, selects his midnight reading, and curls up on his favorite chair. He especially likes mystery stories and tales of horror and the supernatural. As a result, he has developed a very vivid imagination. I'm telling you this because I think it's important for you to know something of Chester's background before I relate to you the story of the events following the arrival of Bunnicula into our home. Let me begin with the first night. It seems that after I went to sleep, Chester, still stewing over the lost milk, settled down with his latest book and attempted to ignore the rumbling in his stomach. The room was dark and quiet. This did not prevent his reading, of course. Since, as you know, cats can see in the dark. Cats can see in the dark. A shaft of moonlight fell across the rabbit's cage and spilled onto the floor below. The wind and the rain had stopped, and as Chester read Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, he became increasingly aware of the eerie stillness that had taken their place. As Chester tells it, he suddenly felt compelled to look at the rabbit. I don't know what came over me, he said to me the next morning, but a cold chill ran down my spine. The little bunny had begun to move for the first time since he had been put in his cage. He lifted his tiny nose and inhaled deeply, as if gathering sustenance from the moonlight. He slicked his ear back close to his body, and for the first time, Chester said, I noticed that the peculiar marking on his forehead, what had seemed an ordinary black spot between his ears, took a strange V shape, which connected with the big black patch that covered his back and each side of his neck. It looked as if he was wearing a coat. No more like a cape than a coat. Through the silence had drifted the strains of remote and exotic music. Exotic music. I could have sworn it was a gypsy violin, Chester told me. I thought that perhaps a caravan was passing by, so I ran to the window. I remembered my mother telling